Hi everyone, my name is Sonia, and for my hazardous exploration, I will be focusing on a 4.8 magnitude earthquake that hit the Samaria Gorge, located on the island of Crete in Greece. So, on the day of this event, it was August 13th, 2023 at 10:49 a.m. A Spanish hiker was enjoying his hike and vacation when huge chunks of rock collapsed on him, causing him leg injuries. A helicopter rushed him to safety. He was taken to a local hospital where he had surgery to unfortunately amputate his leg. Following that helicopter exit, more than 600 hikers were evacuated outside of the gorge to safety. So I've actually been to the Samaria Gorge. It's beautiful. These are some personal photos that I took. I was actually there in 2023, the summer of 2023. My friend was on a solo trip in Europe, and I visited her, and we hiked the gorge. I hiked it in just Converse, which was a bold move because my feet really hurt after. But it's beautiful. It has a lot of geological characteristics that really sparked my interest within my research findings for this presentation. As for the tectonic setting of Crete, I have a figure here that shows the tectonic setting. The island is situated over the active subduction zone of the African plate under the Eurasian plate. And the Samaria Gorge is controlled by compressional tectonics. So folding and intense faulting is the result of those compressional tectonics. Since the African plate is subducting beneath the Eurasian plate, there's actually an uplift of the landmass of Crete, causing the subduction and the uplift. The tension is created in the Aegean plate, so it stretches and thins, and that gorge was formed actually due to this rift in structures and faults. Here is a model of the tectonic units in Western Crete, creating faulting and the configuration of the rock layers. So, on the left, the far left group, we see the Platten Kalk group. And this is the deepest and oldest foundational rock layer. It's made of hard, altered rocks and forms the core of Crete's major mountains, including the White Mountains in Samaria Gorge. And then we see the overlying unit, the tri-poly formations, which are thrust into their current position. The phyllite nappe is a rock layer that sits directly on top of that platin kalk group in the tri-poly unit. And this is a rock layer that kind of adds to that stretching and thinning. The tripolus nappe is the unit that overlies the phyllite nappe and was formed roughly between the middle and upper Triassic periods, and it's composed of carbonate rocks like limestone and slate, and it has been heavily fractured and altered due to those compressional tectonics. And then the Pindos nappe is found above the tripolus nappe, and this unit dates back from the upper Triassic to the middle Pala Paleocene. It's a really hard one to era to pronounce. The uppermost nappe is the highest and most complex set of rock layers, and it's formed from a pile of nappes. So those compressional tectonics cause the rock layers to fold and form thrust sheets, and thrust sheets are large slices of rock that are pushed up and over other rocks along a type of fault called the thrust fault, and that's what's happening and causes that rift in this figure. So this figure is showing the thrust faulting that is occurring on the African lithosphere, and you can see the Aegean crust is right above that within Crete. And again, the common types of faulting are thrust faulting, and this thrusting process occurs over the westernmost part of the island at a deeper and more external geodynamic setting. In 365 AD, there was a earthquake in Crete, which caused a large uplift in southwestern Crete. And it results in this, as you can see in the figure, the shallow, blind crustal thrust ramp. So again, these are some personal pictures that I took of the rivers and mountains to include into this presentation. I found these pictures way back in my camera roll, and the rivers are so beautiful. The Samaria River flows through the gorge, contributing to its erosional process through its geomorphological structure. And it's located in those white mountains, which creates the core, and also those big mountain ranges. And the erosion that's happening here is called fluvial erosion, which is an intense along the gorge, and it occurs actually between October and April when precipitation and water runoff are increased. Here I have a figure that shows the kind of rock configurations of Crete, and you can see the lithology and the legend to the bottom left that shows the rock types. So again, Samaria Gorge is composed of carbonate rocks, and near the exit of the gorge, marine terrace formations are seen. And marine terraces are lifted platforms that were once at sea level, but have been raised by those compressional tectonics. And carbonate rocks are thinly bedded with sedimentary rock or cherts. So moving on from that to cherts, how are these rocks and forms created? To the left, upper left, you can see those strips, which are cherts that accompany thin-bedded carbonate rocks, which were once created in a marine environment. And that, as I just said, like the area was once an ancient deep sea basin where these sediments accumulated over time. And alluvial fanning happens, which is forms when a river exits a narrow valley and flows into a nearly flat area. So since Crete has a large amount of seismic activity, there have been hundreds of geological hazards that have happened, but I'm only, for the sake of time, I'll only name a couple. One dated back to 368 BC, which destroyed many of Crete's cities. And recently, on September 18th, 2024, a woman from Ukraine died to a rock landing on her head, unfortunately caused by a landslide, and she experienced a brain hemorrhage. And the pictures here, you can see that landslide occurring, and then a rescue team trying to save her and actually rescue hikers that were also there. So there were over 1,000 hikers there on that day within the gorge. 300 of them became blocked and were then rescued. So I found a really interesting geological exercise that occurred almost a year after the Spanish hiker in 2023 was injured. This earthquake simulation occurred on April 22nd through the 24th of 2024, and it was tested due to Crete's seismotectonic characteristics and need for more emergency response precautions without causing real harm. So this was simulated. You can see a picture here on the right where there are emergency response teams. They are acting out a simulation of an event that could likely occur. So no one was actually injured. People were acting in this simulation. And this was put on by or conducted by the Hellenic Ministry of Climate Crisis and Civil Protection, which was enforced by the Prime Minister of Greece. So the first strong earthquake that was simulated in this scenario had a magnitude of 6.4 that occurred at 10:20 local time, 10:20 a.m. And then a second major earthquake, which had a magnitude of 7.2, occurred 24 hours after the previous one. And then following that, a tsunami warning was followed a few minutes later on that same day. And there was a lot of earthquake environmental effects happening, like landslides, liquefaction, and rockfall. Around 150,000 people in Crete participated in this event, having prior knowledge of the simulation that included evacuations of public services and locate other locations where the community members were present. So in the figure right here, we can see that techniques were being uh, drawn out to locate simulated trapped individuals, and rescue operations were using specialized tools and equipment to safely remove debris. And then they had a medical triage team for simulated victims, prioritizing critical injuries, and extraction of those simulated victims were used to safe evacuation protocols. So, a chain of events that occurs when landslide and rockfall that are induced by an earthquake happens, and this first step is there's ongoing tectonic collision that I've talked about of Crete seismicity, which includes stress on Earth's crust. And due to the position at the compression of the African and Eurasian plates, rupture occurs, releasing energy that's sent out in seismic waves and starts that earthquake. Once the earthquake starts, seismic waves cause motion through the ground motion through the ground. And the severity of that shaking depends on the earthquake's magnitude, right? So on August 13th, when that man's leg was injured, the magnitude was only 4.9. That's a large earthquake. But the one that was simulated was 6.4. So there was more destruction that was created. So they're trying to create a severe situation so they can be prepared. So the gorge's steep slopes are affected by seismic shaking. The shaking then causes the rock mass to weaken, reducing resistance that holds that rock up. And the repeated shaking then causes detachment of the rock structures, and already weathered rocks due to erosion or earthquakes that have cracks in them worsens that risk of landslide. Once broken, the rock will fall or bounce down the slope, which hurt humans and cause fatalities like the hiker in 2023 and the landslide that occurred on September 18th. And then gravity then heightens the speed and momentum of the rock due to steep slopes, which is very confined in the gorge because everything's very closely packed in. All those rocks are very tight. So, human contributions and lesson learned from the simulation. Some lessons that came out from the simulation was creating operational centers. So, the importance for regional centers and around Crete were fostered to foster coordination and ensure faster communication between first responders. And also hazard assessment. So after that earthquake simulation, creators noted that due to changing environmental effects like landslides, implementing constant risk assessment is needed in highly populated areas like Samaria Gorge. And then from just, I was a tourist there, and then like researching about the geological findings, I think from a building perspective, building paths and bridges on these rocks that are very likely to fall on the steep slopes for tourists can increase the risk of rockfall leading to injury or death when that earthquake does occur. And then also the large amount of tourists that visit the gorge can lead to overcrowding and risks of people being trapped, like we saw like 600 people being trapped and having to be rescued or having to evacuate during a hazard. So, a couple studies, there was a simulation study, and then two other studies that I found that show geological understanding and advancements for people who are interested is a one that was a comprehensive review of existing models and investigation on geomorphological evolution in Samaria Gorge. And this review looked at three geological models in Crete for the entirety of Samaria Gorge, highlighting that's very necessary to implement cutting-edge advancements like 3D geological modeling to clearly and accurately display complex structures. So we can see that on the upper figure with the red and blue markings. And this adds to georeferencing original maps and digitizing existing maps. And then the second study I found was called The Contribution of Geological Heritage to Geoeducation, a case study from Samaria Gorge. This is a really cool study and it creates an interactive story map that I wish I looked into before I went on the hike of the gorge, where users and tourists can see how the gorge was formed back in BC eras before they visit to enhance their experience and also provide information to people who aren't geologists or don't haven't taken a geology class to follow the geomorphological evolution of the gorge. And I think this information can help people plan their trip accordingly to better understand the risks of visiting when erosion is heavy. So the policies within Crete surrounding the seismic activity, there are laws that are put in place prior to the simulation and was updated after, but prior to the simulation, the legal framework for civil protection in Greece was based on this law you see here, and it outlines prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery measures for disasters. And the law introduces and defines a new integrated disaster management system, organization, responsibility, and corporate cooperation with authorities involved in that disaster management cycle. So the impacts on residents and the changes were made after the simulation, we can see a model here that shows it's all in Greek, but it's showing the different changes that will be made for residents. So it increases safety, strengthens resilience against future seismic events. And then lots of a public awareness and training was done because they were simulating earthquakes that would surely to affect um, people living there, but their awareness was reached to the general population about emergency shelters and protective measures and improved emergency response training. Also, there's lots of education. 14,000 teachers and 60,000 students were reached to ensure understanding of simulation and what this means. And the exercises ensure identifying the weaknesses before an actual hazard occurs to ensure safety and for residents and tourists. And I think informing students about earthquake precaution, can impact them in a positive way to understand and educate them on the reality of the geologic hazards that happen where they live, where they form community. Okay, so in conclusion, I covered the introduction to the specific hazard, the damage caused by that earthquake, the tectonic setting of Crete, the geologic setting of Crete, the geologic causes that happen when rockfall occurs induced by earthquake or landslides, human contribution and lessons learned, geologists' understanding of hazards, or the public's understanding of hazards and advancements towards that, government reform, and impact on the community. Thank you so much. Here are my references.